People like you don't get to sit up here with us real passengers. First class is for those who belong." The words sliced through the hushed first-class cabin of Global Wings Flight 387, wielded like a weapon by Heather Wilson, a flight attendant whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried deliberate sharp, meant to be heard by those nearby. The target of her disdain stood frozen in the aisle. Dr. Amara Jenkins, still gripping her boarding pass. Her expression a careful mask of composure that had been perfected through years of similar encounters. Across the aisle, Elaine Thompson's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. She adjusted her cream cashmere travel set and pearl earrings, nodding approvingly at Heather's intervention. Finally, she whispered loudly to her husband in 2B, "I thought they were letting just anybody in here these days." The first-class cabin fell quiet. A man rustled his newspaper nervously. A woman 2 rows back pretended to be absorbed in her tablet. No one spoke up. No one challenged what was happening. What Heather and Elaine didn't realize was that in exactly 45 minutes they would face not just consequences, but the most humiliating moment of their professional and social lives. The discrimination playing out in the soft lighting of Global Wings' premium cabin at 9:43 p.m. in Terminal 4 at LAX was about to trigger a chain reaction that would reshape airline policy and careers and make headlines nationwide. Dr. Amara Jenkins took a deep breath. She had survived medical school, grueling residencies, and countless surgeries where children's lives hung in the balance. She could certainly survive this moment of petty bigotry. "My ticket," she said, calmly extending her boarding pass again, "is for seat 2D. I'd like to sit down now." Heather didn't take the boarding pass. Instead, she crossed her arms and raised her eyebrows. "Ma'am, there seems to be a mistake. This section is reserved for our premium passengers." The implication was clear. Amara couldn't possibly be one of those. "I'm quite aware of that," Amara replied, her voice steady. "And I am one of those passengers." Elaine Thompson let out a theatrical sigh loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just don't understand boundaries," she said to her husband, who nodded dutifully. As Amara stood her ground, she caught the eye of Thomas Rivera in seat 3C, who was watching the interaction with growing concern. She noticed Sophia Palmer in 4A discreetly angling her phone, the red recording light blinking. And she spotted James Williams, a distinguished-looking older man in 1A, observing with narrowed eyes. What none of them knew, not Heather, not Elaine, not any of the watching passengers, was that First Officer Nathaniel Turner, currently completing pre-flight checks in the cockpit, was Dr. Amara Jenkins's husband, and he was about to learn exactly how his wife was being treated. Dr. Amara Jenkins had spent the last 72 hours performing 3 consecutive brain surgeries on children with rare congenital malformations. As one of America's top pediatric neurosurgeons at Columbia Medical, she was accustomed to pressure life and death decisions made in milliseconds with steady hands and clear vision. But this kind of pressure, the weight of prejudice, the burden of other people's assumptions, was a different beast altogether. At 37, Amara had scaled mountains in her field. She'd pioneered a new technique for repairing arteriovenous malformations in infant brains that had reduced mortality rates by 43%. She'd authored papers in the most prestigious medical journals. Just yesterday, she'd presented her groundbreaking work at the International Conference on Pediatric Neurosurgery in Los Angeles, receiving a standing ovation from the same peers who had once questioned her abilities. She wore her success lightly. Tonight, dressed in tailored black slacks, a simple blue cashmere sweater, and comfortable loafers, she carried nothing that screamed status. Her wedding ring was elegant but understated. Her watch was high quality but not flashy. Her carry-on contained medical journals, not designer logos. As she stood in the aisle, Amara thought about the first time she'd faced this particular flavor of discrimination. She was 22, a first-year medical student at Johns Hopkins, attending a formal fundraising gala. She'd been stopped at the door by a security guard who insisted she must be looking for the service entrance. When she produced her invitation, he reluctantly let her pass only for a donor, to later ask her to fetch him a drink, assuming she was waitstaff. That night, her professor, a formidable neurosurgeon named Dr. Eleanor Wright, had witnessed the interaction. "You have two choices," Dr. Wright had told her afterward. "Let their ignorance derail you, or use it as fuel. But remember this, in medicine, composure isn't just professional, it's tactical. The moment you lose it is the moment they win." Amara had never forgotten those words. They'd become her North Star through residency, through fellowships, through building her practice. When a patient's parent requested the real doctor instead of her. When colleagues attributed her success to diversity initiatives rather than brilliance. When hospital administrators questioned her authority in ways they never questioned her white male counterparts. Now, standing in this first-class aisle, exhausted after 3 days of saving lives and sharing knowledge, all Amara wanted was to sink into seat 2D, close her eyes, and sleep during the 5-hour flight to New York. Instead, she was fighting for the basic dignity of being believed. She thought briefly of Nathaniel, her husband of 8 years, currently in the cockpit. They had planned this, carefully booking separate tickets using her maiden name, making sure no one would connect them. Nathaniel had been collecting data on discrimination in aviation for months. This wasn't meant to be a setup. It was simply supposed to be Amara flying home on the same flight as her husband, observing without intervention. But clearly something had already gone very wrong. Taking a deep breath, Amara made her choice. The same choice she'd been making for years. Dignity over rage. Composure over catharsis. She would not give them the satisfaction of losing her cool. She would stand calm and immovable until they recognized her humanity or revealed the full extent of their prejudice for all to see. Global Wings Flight 387's first-class cabin gleamed with understated luxury. 14 spacious seats upholstered in buttery leather were arranged in a 2-2 configuration, each with its own personal entertainment system and adjustable privacy screen. Recessed lighting cast a warm golden glow over polished wood accents and champagne-colored fixtures. The cabin had been designed to convey exclusivity, a sanctuary for those who could afford the premium experience. Flight attendants moved with practiced grace, offering hot towels and pre-departure beverages to passengers who had already been seated. The air smelled faintly of citrus and vanilla, the signature scent Global Wings diffused through its premium cabins. In Seat 1A, James Williams, a 60-year-old retired federal judge with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, observed the unfolding situation over the rim of his reading glasses. He'd spent decades presiding over discrimination cases, and he recognized the patterns playing out before him. His mouth tightened in disapproval as he watched Heather Wilson's dismissive treatment of Dr. Jenkins. Across from him in 1B sat a middle-aged executive, absorbed in his laptop, seemingly oblivious to the tension building in the aisle. In row 2, Elaine Thompson and her husband Richard occupied seats 2A and 2B. Elaine, 58, exuded the confidence of old money and entitlement. Her blonde hair was expensively highlighted and styled in a perfect bob. Her cream cashmere travel set probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She wore several carats of diamonds on her fingers and wrists, as if afraid the world might forget her status for even a moment. Seat 2D. Amara's assigned seat remained empty, the subject of the current standoff. In row 3, Thomas Rivera, a 42-year-old Hispanic business executive, watched with growing discomfort. As the founder of a successful tech company, he was no stranger to prejudice himself, often being mistaken for IT staff at his own corporate events. He made brief eye contact with Dr. Jenkins, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Beside him in 3B sat a young woman in designer athleisure headphones on, seemingly unaware of the confrontation. In row 4, Sophia Palmer, a 35-year-old social media influencer with a substantial following, had already begun discreetly recording the interaction. With practiced subtlety, she angled her phone to capture the scene while appearing to scroll through her feed. Her platform normally focused on travel and luxury lifestyle content, but she had recently begun highlighting issues of inequality in the spaces she frequented. The cabin crew consisted of Heather Wilson, the 45-year-old lead flight attendant currently blocking Amara's path, Carlos Mendez, a 29-year-old junior flight attendant restocking the galley, and Jennifer Blake, the 51-year-old purser who was currently checking something in the forward cabin. Behind the locked cockpit door, Captain Andrew Phillips and First Officer Nathaniel Turner were completing their pre-flight checks, unaware of the discrimination unfolding just feet away. The tense standoff continued as Heather maintained her position in the aisle, physically blocking Amara's access to seat 2D. With an exaggerated sigh, she finally took Amara's boarding pass, examining it with theatrical scrutiny. "This does say 2D, she admitted reluctantly, "but there must be some mistake in the system. Let me check with my colleague." As Heather stepped away to consult with Carlos, Amara remained standing in the aisle, acutely aware of the eyes on her. Elaine Thompson took the opportunity to stage her first accident. "Oh!" Elaine exclaimed dramatically, reaching for her water bottle. With a flick of her manicured hand, she sent a splash of water across seat 2D. "How clumsy of me." The water darkened the premium leather, creating an obvious wet spot. Elaine made a show of dabbing at it with a cocktail napkin, succeeding only in spreading the moisture further. "So sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "I'm sure they can find you another seat. Perhaps in economy, where it's more appropriate." Amara observed this performance with the same calm detachment she brought to her operating room. "Thank you for your concern," she replied evenly, "but a little water won't bother me." Thomas Rivera frowned at the deliberate sabotage. "Excuse me," he said, offering Amara his unused hot towel. "This might help." Elaine shot Thomas a look of betrayal as Amara accepted the towel with a grateful nod. Heather returned Carlos, trailing behind her. "We've verified your ticket," she announced, as if doing Amara a great favor. "You can take your seat now, but please try to settle in quickly. We're behind schedule." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the unfounded suspicion. Just a grudging permission that should never have been in question. As Amara finally moved to take her seat, carefully drying the wet spot with Thomas's towel, she pulled out her phone. "I should let my husband know we're boarding," she explained, her voice low and calm. The call connected quickly. "Hey," she said softly, "just letting you know I'm on board. We should be taking off soon." Her voice was barely audible over the ambient cabin noise, certainly quieter than the businessman in 1B, who was loudly discussing quarterly projections. Yet Elaine immediately twisted in her seat. "Must you?" she complained loudly. "Some of us are trying to relax before a long flight." Amara ended her call promptly. "Of course. My apologies." Across the aisle, Elaine smirked victoriously at her husband. "Some people," she stage-whispered, "have no understanding of proper etiquette. First class requires a certain refinement." Richard nodded in agreement. "Standards aren't what they used to be." Carlos appeared with pre-departure beverages, offering champagne to the Thompsons with a warm smile. When he reached Amara, his smile remained, but his eyes conveyed an apology. "Would you care for champagne or water?" he asked. "Water, please." "No ice?" Amara replied. As Carlos placed the water on her armrest, Heather swooped in. "Everything all right here?" she asked, though her question was clearly directed at the Thompsons, not at Amara. "Fine now," Elaine replied pointedly, though it was quite disruptive earlier with all the phone calls and commotion. Heather nodded sympathetically. "I'll make sure everyone follows proper first-class etiquette," she assured Elaine, casting a meaningful glance at Amara. The microaggressions continued as boarding completed. Heather repeatedly checked on the comfort of other first-class passengers while ignoring Amara entirely. When she did acknowledge Amara, it was with the bare minimum of professional courtesy, her tone distinctly cooler than the one she used with other passengers. As Amara settled in with her medical journal, Elaine made another comment just loud enough to carry, "I remember when flying first class meant something." When it was exclusive. From his seat in 3C, Thomas Rivera caught Amara's eye and gave a small headshake of disapproval at Elaine's behavior. Sophia Palmer continued her discreet recording, capturing the pattern of subtle discrimination unfolding seat by seat, minute by minute. Judge Williams observed it all, his expression growing increasingly grim as he witnessed the calculated pattern of exclusion being deployed against the poised doctor. In the cockpit, completely unaware of what was transpiring just a few feet away, First Officer Nathaniel Turner continued his pre-flight preparations, expecting his wife to be comfortably settled in for their journey home. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Heather's voice cut sharply through the dimmed cabin. "Ma'am, I've received complaints about your disruptive behavior." Amara looked up from her medical journal momentarily confused. She had been sitting quietly reading for the past 30 minutes, not making a sound. "I'm sorry," she asked. Heather loomed over Amara's seat, arms crossed. "Several passengers have complained about your loud talking and disruptive attitude. This is first class. Other passengers are trying to rest." Amara glanced around, bewildered. She hadn't spoken to anyone since her brief phone call during boarding. Across the aisle, Elaine Thompson watched the confrontation with thinly veiled satisfaction. "I haven't spoken since we took off," Amara replied calmly. "I've been reading quietly." Heather's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I can see that you're getting agitated. Please lower your voice." "I'm not agitated," Amara clarified, maintaining her composure. "I'm simply confused by the accusation." From row 3, Thomas Rivera spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, "but the lady hasn't made any noise. I've been sitting right behind her." Heather barely acknowledged him. "Sir, I'm handling a situation here," Thomas persisted. "But there is no situation. She's been completely quiet." Heather's smile tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, we've received multiple complaints," from whom Thomas challenged. Elaine Thompson twisted in her seat. "I complained," she announced, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's been muttering and making noise since takeoff. Some of us paid good money to be in this cabin, and we expect certain standards of behavior." The implication that Amara hadn't paid good money for her seat hung in the air. Across the aisle, the businessman in 1B looked up from his laptop, irritated by the disruption. "Actually," he said, "the only noise I've heard is this conversation. Can we all just calm down?" Judge Williams removed his reading glasses. "Young lady," he addressed Heather, his voice carrying the gravity of his former profession, "I've been observing this situation, and I'm troubled by what appears to be unfounded accusations against this passenger." Heather's confidence wavered slightly under the judge's authoritative tone, but Elaine pressed on. "She doesn't belong here," Elaine declared, dropping all pretense. "It's obvious. Look at her. She's making everyone uncomfortable." A shocked silence fell over the cabin. The naked prejudice in Elaine's statement was undeniable. Amara took a deep breath, centering herself. "Ms. Wilson," she addressed Heather by the name on her badge. "I understand you're doing your job based on complaints you've received. However, those complaints are unfounded. I have been sitting quietly reading my medical journal since takeoff." "Medical journal?" Elaine scoffed. "Please." Amara ignored the interruption. "I would like to speak with the lead flight attendant, please." Carlos, who had been hovering nearby, witnessing the exchange, stepped forward. "I can get Jennifer," he offered. "That won't be necessary," Heather cut in. "I'm handling this." I insist, Amara said firmly. I have a right to speak with your supervisor when I'm being falsely accused. Sophia Palmer had resumed her discreet recording. James Williams watched with the analytical eye of a judge assessing testimony. Thomas Rivera's expression had darkened from concern to outright anger at the injustice unfolding. Fine Heather conceded tightly. I'll get Jennifer. But ma'am, she added with false concern, if your behavior continues to disrupt our first-class experience, we may need to consider reseating you. As Heather walked away, Thomas leaned forward. That's completely inappropriate, he told Amara quietly. I'm happy to corroborate that you've done nothing wrong. Thank you, Amara replied. I appreciate that. From her seat, Elaine made another loud comment to her husband. This is why we usually fly private. The standards on commercial flights have just plummeted. Amara remained outwardly calm, but inside her heart was racing. This was escalating beyond the data collection that she and Nathaniel had planned. She wondered if she should use their emergency signal, a text message with the code word scalpel, to alert him to the situation. But she hesitated, not wanting to disrupt his professional duties if it wasn't absolutely necessary. Little did she know that the situation was about to deteriorate even further. Jennifer Blake swept into the first-class cabin like a storm front, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. At 51, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had controlled aircraft cabins for decades. Her Global Wings uniform was impeccable, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, not a strand out of place. I understand we have a situation, she stated, coming to stand beside Amara's seat. Before Amara could speak, Heather leaned in to whisper in Jennifer's ear. Jennifer's expression hardened as she listened. Ma'am, Jennifer addressed Amara. I'm Jennifer Blake, the purser on this flight. I understand you've been disruptive and argumentative with my colleague. That's not accurate, Amara replied evenly. I've been sitting quietly. The only disruption occurred when Ms. Wilson confronted me with false accusations of being loud. Jennifer's eyes narrowed. Multiple passengers have complained about your behavior. Which passengers? Thomas Rivera interjected from his seat. Because I've been sitting here the entire time, and the lady hasn't made a sound until your colleague confronted her. Jennifer ignored him. Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again? You've already verified my ticket, Amara pointed out. Twice now. Humor me, Jennifer insisted, extending her hand. Amara retrieved her boarding pass from her bag and handed it over. Jennifer examined it closely as if searching for evidence of forgery. Dr. Jenkins, she read aloud, a note of skepticism in her voice. And what kind of doctor are you? I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon at Columbia Medical Center, Amara answered calmly. Elaine Thompson let out an audible scoff. Of course you are, she muttered. Jennifer gave Amara an assessing look. Do you have any identification that confirms that? Is that standard procedure? Judge Williams inquired from his seat, his tone deceptively mild. Asking passengers to prove their professional qualifications, Jennifer flushed slightly. I'm just trying to get all the facts. The fact, Amara stated clearly, is that my profession is irrelevant to my right to sit in the seat I paid for without being harassed. Nevertheless, she reached into her bag and produced her hospital ID badge with her photo name and title clearly visible. Jennifer examined it, her lips pressed into a thin line. Well, Dr. Jenkins, she said, returning both the boarding pass and ID, regardless of who you are. We have a certain standard of behavior in first class. Our premium passengers expect a peaceful environment. I completely agree, Amara replied, which is why I've been sitting quietly reading my journal. Thomas Rivera decided to intervene more directly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Excuse me, Ms. Blake, I'm Thomas Rivera, CEO of Nexus Technologies. I've been sitting directly behind Dr. Jenkins since boarding, and she has been absolutely silent. The only disruption has come from the passenger in 2A who keeps making loud comments and from your flight attendant who has repeatedly confronted Dr. Jenkins without cause. Jennifer's expression wavered as she realized she might be on shaky ground. Mr. Rivera, please return to your seat. The seatbelt sign is still on. I'll sit when you address this situation fairly, he replied firmly. Jennifer turned to Elaine. Mrs. Thompson, can you please explain the nature of your complaint? Elaine straightened clearly, pleased to be acknowledged as the authority. This woman has been disruptive since she boarded, talking loudly on her phone, making noise, muttering to herself. She's clearly not accustomed to first-class etiquette. It's making my husband and me very uncomfortable. That's simply not true, Thomas countered. Mrs. Thompson herself has been the disruptive one, making loud comments and even deliberately spilling water on Dr. Jenkins' seat during boarding. Jennifer looked taken aback by this accusation. Is that true? Mrs. Thompson? Absolutely not, Elaine replied indignantly. How dare you? Do you know who my husband is? From his seat, Judge Williams spoke up again. I observed the water incident as well, he stated calmly. It appeared quite deliberate. Amara had just returned to reading her medical journal when she felt something cold splash across her lap. She looked up to see Elaine Thompson leaning across the aisle, an empty wine glass in her hand, feigning shock. Oh my goodness, Elaine exclaimed with theatrical distress. How clumsy of me. Red wine spread across Amara's lap, staining her clothes and dripping onto the leather seat. More concerning to Amara, however, was that several drops had landed on her medical journal, an irreplaceable advance copy containing her own peer-reviewed research. This was no accident. Elaine had waited until the flight attendants were occupied in the galley before striking. The deliberate malice was unmistakable. For the first time, Amara's composure slipped slightly. That was intentional. She stated, her voice firm but controlled as she tried to blot the wine from her journal with a napkin. How dare you? Elaine gasped, playing the victim. It was an accident. I can't believe you would accuse me of something so petty. The commotion immediately brought Heather rushing back. One look at the scene, Amara with wine stains on her clothing and Elaine with an empty glass, and her conclusion was already formed. What's happening here? Heather demanded. She's accusing me of spilling wine on her. Deliberately? Elaine complained, her voice quavering with false injury. After I apologized for an innocent accident. This is harassment. Amara looked Heather directly in the eye. Ms. Wilson, this passenger has been targeting me since I boarded. First with comments, then with water on my seat, and now with wine. This was not an accident. Thomas Rivera stood again. I saw the whole thing. Mrs. Thompson deliberately reached across the aisle to spill that wine. It was completely intentional. He's lying, Elaine protested. He's been conspiring with her this entire flight. Sophia Palmer spoke up from her seat. I have it on video, she said quietly, holding up her phone. The spill was deliberate. Heather's eyes widened at the mention of video, but she quickly regained her composure. Ma'am, please put your phone away. Recording other passengers is against our policy. Documenting discrimination isn't against policy. Judge Williams interjected, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. In fact, it's protected activity. Jennifer Blake returned to the scene quickly, assessing the situation. What's going on here? This passenger is causing a scene after an accidental spill, Heather reported, gesturing toward Amara. And now others are getting involved, recording without consent, making accusations. It wasn't accidental, Thomas insisted. We all saw it. Jennifer's expression hardened. This situation is escalating beyond what's acceptable in our first-class cabin. She turned to Amara. Dr. Jenkins, I need you to come with me to discuss this privately. I'd prefer to stay in my seat, Amara replied, still trying to salvage her journal. I've done nothing wrong. Your attitude is becoming increasingly disruptive, Jennifer stated coldly. I'm going to have to insist. Amara looked around at the faces watching this confrontation unfold. Thomas's outrage, Sophia's quiet documentation, Judge Williams's measured assessment, and Elaine's triumphant smirk. She made a decision. "I would like to speak with the captain," she requested firmly. "This has gone beyond a customer service issue. I'm being discriminated against, and I have a right to address this with the pilot in command." Jennifer's face flushed. "The captain is busy flying the aircraft. I'm handling this situation. Under FAA regulations, the captain is the final authority on passenger issues affecting flight safety or cabin order." Amara stated her knowledge of aviation protocols, surprising Jennifer. "I'm formally requesting to speak with him." Jennifer and Heather exchanged glances, clearly thrown by Amara's confidence and knowledge. "Fine," Jennifer said tightly. "I'll speak to the flight deck, but in the meantime, I need you to come with me to the galley." "I'll stay in my assigned seat until the captain is available," Amara replied calmly. "I'm not legally obligated to move unless I'm interfering with safety, which I am not." Jennifer's face contorted with barely contained anger. She leaned in closer to Amara. "Listen," she hissed quietly. "Executive Platinum members like Mrs. Thompson spend thousands of dollars with us monthly. You're a one-time passenger causing problems. Do the math." The mask had finally slipped, revealing the true basis for the discriminatory treatment. "I see," Amara replied softly. "So this isn't about behavior at all. It's about perceived status." Jennifer straightened, realizing she'd said too much. Without another word, she turned and headed toward the cockpit to use the interphone. Minutes later, the cabin speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a situation in the cabin, we're going to return to our departure gate at LAX. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival." A collective groan went up from the passengers. Elaine looked momentarily alarmed, but Heather quickly leaned down to reassure her. "Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson. We're just removing the disruptive passenger. You'll be on your way shortly." Amara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. This had escalated far beyond what she and Nathaniel had anticipated. She had never imagined it would come to this, being removed from a flight for the crime of being black in first class. But as the plane began its return to LAX, she felt an odd sense of calm. Because now, finally, Nathaniel would know. And what happened next would change everything. The aircraft taxied back to Gate 42A at LAX Terminal 4, the engines whining down as it came to a complete stop. The cabin remained unusually silent, the typical sounds of passengers preparing to deplane absent. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jennifer Blake stood at the front of the first-class cabin, her expression professionally blank, but her posture rigid with tension. Heather Wilson hovered near the Thompsons, continuing to offer reassurances in hushed tones. Carlos Mendez remained in the galley, visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. The cabin door opened and 2 airport security officers stepped aboard. Behind them came a Global Wings customer service manager in a crisp navy suit, her name badge identifying her as Patricia Alvarez. "Dr. Jenkins." Patricia called, scanning the first-class cabin. "Could you please identify yourself?" Amara raised her hand slightly. "I'm Dr. Jenkins." Patricia approached the security officers flanking her. "Dr. Jenkins, I've been informed that you're being removed from this flight due to disruptive behavior. Please gather your belongings and come with us." "On what specific grounds am I being removed?" Amara asked calmly. "I've violated no FAA regulations or airline policies." Patricia glanced at Jennifer, who stepped forward. "Dr. Jenkins has been confrontational, accusatory, and has created a hostile environment in our premium cabin," she stated. "Multiple warnings were issued." "That's simply not true, Thomas," Rivera interjected. "I've been sitting behind Dr. Jenkins the entire flight and she's done nothing wrong. In fact, she's been the victim of harassment from another passenger and your flight attendants." Patricia looked uncertain. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I'm not just concerned, Thomas interrupted. I'm a witness, and I'm not the only one. Judge Williams stood his tall frame commanding attention. Young lady, he addressed Patricia. I'm James Williams, retired federal judge. I've observed this entire situation, and what I've witnessed is a textbook case of discriminatory treatment. Dr. Jenkins has remained composed and reasonable throughout a series of provocations. Patricia's professional demeanor wavered. This was clearly not the straightforward removal she had expected. I have video evidence, Sophia Palmer added, holding up her phone. Mrs. Thompson, in 2A, deliberately spilled wine on Dr. Jenkins after making several discriminatory comments. The flight attendants have consistently ignored her behavior while targeting Dr. Jenkins without cause. Elaine Thompson's face flushed crimson. How dare you? This is an invasion of my privacy. I'll sue. Discrimination in public accommodations isn't entitled to privacy, Mrs. Thompson, Judge Williams remarked dryly. The security officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the clear-cut situation they'd been briefed on. Regardless of the circumstances, Patricia insisted, trying to regain control. When the cabin crew determines a passenger needs to be removed, we must follow protocol. Dr. Jenkins, please come with us. You can file a formal complaint afterward if you feel you've been treated unfairly. Amara considered her options. She could create a scene, refuse to move, force them to physically remove her. But that wasn't who she was. Her dignity, her control over the narrative mattered more. I'll comply with your request, she said evenly, but I want it documented that I'm being removed without cause based on discriminatory treatment. And I would like the names and badge numbers of everyone involved in this decision. Patricia hesitated, then nodded. That's your right. As Amara gathered her belongings, including her wine-stained medical journal, Thomas stood again. I'm documenting this as well, he stated firmly. And I'll be happy to provide testimony about what I've witnessed here today. As will I, Judge Williams added. And I'll be posting this video, Sophia declared, though she kept her voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. The world should see what happened here. Amara stepped into the aisle, her head high. As she moved toward the exit, she paused beside Carlos, who had been silent throughout the confrontation. Sometimes, she told him quietly, the hardest thing isn't facing discrimination. It's watching it happen and saying nothing. The young flight attendant flinched as if slapped, shame evident in his expression. Amara walked the length of the aircraft, conscious of the eyes following her progress. Some passengers looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the injustice. Others watched with sympathy or outrage. A few recorded the scene on their phones. As she reached the jet bridge, escorted by the security officers, and Patricia, Amara finally sent the text she had been holding back. A single word to Nathaniel Scalpel. It was their code for an emergency, a signal that something had gone critically wrong and immediate intervention was needed. Back in the first-class cabin, Elaine Thompson was already declaring victory. Finally, she announced loudly, "Now perhaps we can have the civilized experience we paid for." Jennifer and Heather busied themselves preparing for departure, avoiding the accusing stares of Thomas, Sophia, and Judge Williams. None of them realized that the true reckoning was yet to come, that within minutes their comfortable world of unchecked privilege was about to be shattered beyond repair. 20 minutes after Amara's removal, the first-class cabin of Flight 387 had settled into an uneasy quiet. The Thompsons chatted smugly. Heather Wilson was attending to their every need, and most passengers had returned to their books and devices, though the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Jennifer Blake's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're just completing some paperwork regarding the previous situation, and we should be on our way shortly. Thank you for your patience." Thomas Rivera exchanged glances with Judge Williams and Sophia Palmer. None of them had resumed their previous activities. Each felt complicit in an injustice they had been unable to prevent despite their efforts. The cockpit door opened. Captain Andrew Phillips emerged, his silver-streaked hair and distinguished bearing immediately commanding attention. At 55, his presence carried the gravitas of thousands of flight hours and decades of experience. His face was unreadable as he surveyed the first-class cabin. Behind him came First Officer Nathaniel Turner, still in full uniform, his expression controlled but his eyes intense. Following them were two men in suits, each wearing FAA credentials on lanyards around their necks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Phillips announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cabin. "I'm Andrew Phillips, your captain. I need your attention for a moment." The cabin fell silent. Jennifer Blake hurried forward, clearly confused by the captain's unexpected appearance in the passenger cabin. "Captain, is everything all right? We're almost ready for departure." Phillips raised a hand, silencing her. "No, Ms. Blake. Everything is not all right. My first officer has just informed me of a situation that occurred in this cabin while we were completing our preparations for departure. A situation I find deeply disturbing." Jennifer's face paled. She shot a panicked glance at Heather, who had frozen in the aisle. Captain Phillips continued. "It appears that a passenger was removed from this aircraft without just cause based on discriminatory treatment by both crew members and another passenger." Elaine Thompson bristled visibly. "That woman was disruptive and had an attitude problem. She didn't belong, Mrs. Thompson." Phillips cut her off sharply. "I strongly advise you to consider your next words very carefully." One of the FAA officials stepped forward. "I'm Kevin Morrison, FAA Safety Inspector. We're here to investigate a reported incident of passenger discrimination and improper removal procedures." The second FAA official, a stern-looking woman, added, "I'm Diana Ramirez, FAA Air Carrier Operations Inspector. This investigation will include statements from crew and passengers' review of any available recordings and assessment of regulatory compliance." Jennifer Blake's professional composure crumbled. "Sir, we followed standard procedures for a disruptive passenger." First Officer Nathaniel Turner finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying an undercurrent of controlled fury. "The passenger you removed, Dr. Amara Jenkins, is my wife." A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Heather Wilson's hand flew to her mouth. Jennifer Blake staggered back slightly as if physically struck. The Thompsons' expressions shifted from indignation to dawning horror. What Jennifer whispered. "You heard me correctly," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "The woman you profiled, harassed, falsely accused, and removed from this aircraft is my wife, Dr. Amara Jenkins Turner, Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Columbia Medical Center." Carlos Mendez, watching from the galley doorway, closed his eyes briefly in shame. "We were conducting research on discriminatory practices in aviation," Nathaniel explained. "My wife was traveling under her professional name, seated separately from me to observe treatment of minority passengers in premium cabins. We never expected it to escalate to removal." Captain Phillips addressed the cabin again. "I was not consulted about this removal, which violates our own protocols. Had I been informed, I would have intervened immediately." Inspector Morrison stepped forward. "Global Wings has strict non-discrimination policies as required by federal law. From what we've gathered so far, those policies appear to have been egregiously violated today." Elaine Thompson's face had drained of color. Her husband placed a restraining hand on her arm as she opened her mouth to speak. "I suggest you remain silent, Mrs. Thompson," Judge Williams advised from his seat. "You've already made statements that could be construed as admissions of discriminatory intent." Sophia Palmer held up her phone. "I have everything on video." Mrs. Thompson's comments. "The deliberate whine spill the flight attendant's biased response, all of it." Inspector Ramirez nodded. "We'll need to review that footage." Ms. Palmer. Sophia Palmer. "Ms. Palmer, would you be willing to share that with us?" "Absolutely." Jennifer Blake found her voice. First Officer Turner. "I had no idea she was your wife. We were responding to complaints from a valued customer, and that's exactly the problem," Nathaniel interrupted. "You valued one passenger's comfort over another passenger's dignity based on appearances and assumptions. You never questioned Mrs. Thompson's clearly false accusations. You never truly listened to Dr. Jenkins or the witnesses who spoke up for her." Captain Phillips turned to the flight attendants. "Ms. Blake, Ms. Wilson, you are both removed from duty effective immediately. You'll exit the aircraft with the FAA inspectors and report to the chief flight attendant's office for formal statements." "But," Heather began. "That's not a request," Phillips stated firmly. "It's a directive from your captain, and it's non-negotiable." Nathaniel addressed the Thompsons directly. "Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, you'll also be deplaning. Your behavior constitutes a violation of Global Wings' passenger conduct policy. Additionally, the FBI has been notified about the potential hate crime aspects of this incident." "Hate crime?" Elaine sputtered. "That's absurd." "Richard, say something." Richard Thompson, looking ashen, remained silent. Captain Phillips addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize, but this flight will be delayed further while we replace the removed crew members. Global Wings has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination that clearly wasn't upheld today. I take personal responsibility for that failure, and I assure you it will be addressed at the highest levels of the company." As Jennifer and Heather gathered their personal belongings, their faces masks of humiliation, Nathaniel turned to the FAA inspectors. "My wife is waiting in the terminal. I'd like to bring her back on board." Inspector Morrison nodded. "Of course, First Officer Turner. We'll escort these individuals off, and you can bring Dr. Jenkins back to her rightful seat." The cabin remained silent as Jennifer, Heather, and the Thompsons were led toward the exit. Just before stepping through the door, Elaine turned back, her expression now desperate. "This is a misunderstanding," she pleaded to the cabin at large. "I never meant save it for your statement. Mrs. Thompson." Inspector Ramirez cut her off. "The evidence will speak for itself." As the door closed behind them, Captain Phillips addressed the remaining passengers. "I apologize for the continued delay. Replacement crew members are already on their way. In the meantime, our remaining flight attendant, Mr. Mendez, will attend to your needs." Carlos stepped forward, visibly shaken. "Yes, sir." As Phillips returned to the cockpit, Nathaniel Turner headed down the jet bridge to find his wife leaving behind a cabin forever changed by what had just transpired. Thomas Rivera caught Judge Williams's eye across the aisle. "Did that really just happen?" he asked quietly. The judge nodded solemnly. "Justice," he replied, "sometimes arrives unexpectedly." Nathaniel Turner strode through the terminal, his captain's uniform parting the crowds like a silent authority. His face remained professionally composed, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury that few had ever witnessed. He spotted Amara sitting alone in the customer service area, still dignified, despite the wine stains on her clothing. When she saw him approaching, she stood. There was no dramatic reunion, no public display, just a meeting of eyes that communicated volumes between two people who had weathered storms together before. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly when he reached her. "I'm fine," she assured him, though the tension in her shoulders told a different story. "It's nothing I haven't experienced before." "It ends today," he promised. "The FAA is on board. Phillips is fully briefed. We're taking you back to your seat." Patricia Alvarez, the customer service manager who had escorted Amara off the plane, approached cautiously. "First Officer Turner, I had no idea," the flight crew said. "We'll discuss your role in this later." Nathaniel interrupted his tone, leaving no room for excuses. "Right now, my wife is returning to her rightfully purchased seat." As they walked back toward the gate, Amara briefed Nathaniel on exactly what had transpired. His jaw tightened as she described Elaine's deliberate provocations and the crew's complicity, but he maintained his professional demeanor. They boarded the aircraft together, stepping into a first-class cabin that was noticeably subdued. All eyes turned to them as they entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathaniel announced, "this is Dr. Amara Jenkins Turner, who will be returning to her assigned seat in 2D. Carlos Mendez stepped forward immediately. "Dr. Jenkins, please allow me to escort you to your seat. Can I get you anything? A fresh beverage? A warm towel? Water would be fine. Thank you," Amara replied, her composure intact as she reclaimed her space. Sophia Palmer offered a warm smile from across the aisle. Thomas Rivera reached forward to touch her shoulder briefly in solidarity. Judge Williams nodded with approval. The Thompsons' seats 2A and 2B remained conspicuously empty. As Carlos hurried to fetch water, the main cabin door opened again. FAA inspectors. Morrison and Ramirez returned, accompanied by Lawrence Davidson, the 62-year-old CEO of Global Wings who had been attending a meeting at LAX when the incident was escalated to executive level. Davidson approached Amara directly, his expression grave. "Dr. Jenkins Turner, I'm Lawrence Davidson, CEO of Global Wings. I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you experienced on our aircraft today." Amara regarded him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Davidson, but this isn't about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that affects countless passengers who don't have the advantage of being married to one of your pilots." Davidson nodded, accepting the implicit rebuke. "You're absolutely right. And I assure you we'll be addressing the underlying issues, not just this isolated incident." He turned to address the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the continued delay. I'm Lawrence Davidson, CEO of Global Wings. What occurred on this aircraft today represents a fundamental failure of our values as a company. I want to assure you that we take this matter with the utmost seriousness." He continued. "Flight 387 will be departing shortly with a new cabin crew. Every passenger on this aircraft will receive full refunds for their tickets regardless of fare class, along with additional compensation for the delay and distress caused by this incident." More importantly, Davidson added his gaze, returning to Amara. "I'm inviting Dr. Jenkins Turner and First Officer Turner to help us review and revise our policies and training procedures to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Amara exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. "If doing so would help prevent others from experiencing similar treatment," she replied, "we'd be willing to discuss that possibility." Nathaniel nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about one incident, Mr. Davidson. It's about creating a culture where such behavior is neither tolerated nor enabled." I understand, Davidson assured them. "I believe your perspective would be invaluable in helping us make meaningful, lasting changes." With that, he bowed slightly and stepped back, allowing the replacement crew members to begin their pre-flight preparations. Nathaniel needed to return to the cockpit, but before leaving, he knelt briefly beside Amara's seat. "This wasn't how we planned to gather data," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "No," she agreed, "but perhaps it's exactly the data that was needed." He squeezed her hand gently, then stood and made his way back to the flight deck. The passengers watched him go, many of them now seeing both Nathaniel and Amara in a new light, not just as victims of discrimination, but as potential catalysts for change. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate nearly 3 hours behind schedule, a subdued atmosphere prevailed in the first-class cabin. The wine stain on Amara's clothing had dried to a dull purple. Her damaged medical journal lay carefully wrapped in tissue in her bag. Yet despite these physical reminders of the ordeal, she felt a quiet sense of resolution beginning to form. What had started as a terrible experience might become something transformative, not just for her and Nathaniel, but for countless other travelers who would never know her name but might benefit from the changes her experience would spark. The flight to New York proceeded without further incident. Carlos Mendez and the replacement crew were attentive and professional. Fellow passengers occasionally offered supportive glances or quiet words of solidarity. And when they finally landed at JFK, Amara emerged from the aircraft not just as a passenger who had been wrongfully removed, but as someone who had stood her ground with dignity and was now positioned to effect real change. News of the incident had already begun to spread. Sophia Palmer's video was gaining traction online. Aviation blogs were picking up the story. By morning, it would be national news, with experts weighing in on discrimination in commercial aviation and the particular vulnerability of minority passengers in premium spaces. For Jennifer Blake Heather Wilson and the Thompsons, the reckoning had only just begun. But for Amara and Nathaniel Turner, a different journey was starting, one that would transform a personal humiliation into a powerful force for accountability and reform. 1 week after the incident on Flight 387, Amara and Nathaniel sat across from Lawrence Davidson and his executive team in Global Wings' Manhattan offices. The airline had prepared a generous settlement offer, 7 figures first-class travel for life, and a public apology, all contingent upon a standard confidentiality agreement. Amara slid the document back across the table untouched. "That's not why we're here," she stated firmly. Davidson leaned forward, genuinely puzzled. "Dr. Jenkins Turner, this is one of the largest settlement offers our company has ever made. It acknowledges the wrong that was done to you and compensates you appropriately. It also silences me," Amara pointed out, "and allows Global Wings to treat this as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of a deeper problem." Nathaniel placed a folder on the table. "We have a counter-proposal." Davidson opened it cautiously, then looked up in surprise. "This isn't a settlement demand. It's a reform program." "Exactly," Nathaniel confirmed. "We're not interested in personal compensation. We're interested in fundamental change." What they proposed became known as the Jenkins-Turner Protocol, a comprehensive framework for preventing discrimination in commercial aviation and addressing incidents when they occurred. Its core elements included a verification system for passenger complaints, requiring corroboration before crew members could take punitive actions, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff developed and led by diversity experts, anonymous reporting channels for employees to flag discriminatory behavior, regular audits of passenger removal data to identify patterns of disparate treatment, revision of VIP policies to explicitly prohibit preferential treatment in conflict resolution, creation of an independent oversight committee to monitor implementation and compliance. Instead of compensation, Amara explained, we want Global Wings to fund the implementation of these reforms and to share the framework with other airlines, make it an industry standard, not just a corporate policy. Davidson studied the proposal carefully. This would require a significant investment, far more than the settlement we offered. Yes, Amara acknowledged, because it addresses causes, not symptoms. After 2 hours of detailed discussion, Davidson made his decision. "We'll do it," he announced, surprising his own legal team, not because it's easier or cheaper, but because it's right. Global Wings will implement the Jenkins-Turner Protocol and full fund its development and advocate for its adoption industry-wide. He extended his hand. No confidentiality agreements, no gag orders, complete transparency and full commitment to reform. As they shook hands, Nathaniel added one more condition. "We want the FAA involved. This can't just be a corporate initiative, it needs regulatory backing." "Agreed," Davidson replied, recognizing that this partnership represented not just crisis management, but a fundamental reimagining of his airline's approach to equality and dignity. The announcement of the partnership made headlines across the country. Some business analysts criticized Global Wings for capitulating to pressure, but most recognized the strategic wisdom in embracing reform rather than fighting a losing battle. The company's stock, which had plummeted in the immediate aftermath of the incident, began to stabilize as investors recognized the long-term value of addressing a significant reputational vulnerability. Rather than accepting individual compensation, Amara and Nathaniel directed Global Wings to establish the Jenkins-Turner Foundation, funded with $5 million to provide scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation and medicine. The Foundation's mission wasn't just financial support, but mentorship and advocacy for structural change in both industries. "We're transforming an injustice into an opportunity," Amara explained at the Foundation's launch event. "Not just for individual students, but for the industries they'll help reshape." The FAA initially focused solely on investigating the incident, expanded its scope to examine discriminatory practices across the commercial aviation sector. Inspectors Morrison and Ramirez, who had witnessed the aftermath on Flight 387 firsthand, became advocates within the agency for new guidelines based on the Jenkins-Turner Protocol. "What we've found isn't limited to one airline or one incident." Inspector Ramirez testified at a congressional hearing on transportation equity. "It's a pervasive issue that requires regulatory attention." For Jennifer Blake and Heather Wilson, the consequences extended far beyond termination. The FAA investigation uncovered a pattern of discriminatory incidents throughout their careers, resulting in permanent notations in their airman records that effectively ended their aviation careers. Both eventually issued public apologies, though critics questioned their sincerity versus their desire for rehabilitation. Elaine Thompson's fate proved equally instructive. Beyond the permanent ban from Global Wings, she faced significant social consequences. Her country club quietly declined to renew her membership. Charity organizations removed her from their boards. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with such blatant bigotry. The Thompsons eventually released a statement through their attorney expressing deep regret for the incident while carefully avoiding admission of discriminatory intent. They announced a substantial donation to a civil rights organization, a gesture widely dismissed as damage control rather than genuine contrition. Carlos Mendez, the junior flight attendant who had failed to intervene during the incident, but later provided honest testimony, found unexpected redemption. Global Wings, recognizing the value of his perspective, appointed him to the implementation team for the new protocol. His first-hand experience of the bystander effect and the pressure to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing proved invaluable in designing intervention training. "The hardest lesson I learned," he explained in a training video that would eventually be shown to tens of thousands of aviation professionals, "is that silence in the face of discrimination makes you complicit in it. Our job isn't just serving passengers, it's ensuring their dignity and equal treatment." Throughout this period of intensive reform, Amara and Nathaniel maintained their professional commitments. She performing complex neurosurgeries at Columbia Medical, he flying regular routes for Global Wings. They declined countless media appearances, choosing to focus on the substantive work of change rather than publicity. "This was never about us," Amara reminded a persistent reporter. "It's about creating systems that protect the dignity of every passenger, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing, or whether they have advocates in positions of power." As summer turned to fall, the Jenkins-Turner Protocol moved from concept to reality. Its implementation at Global Wings became a case study in organizational transformation, closely watched by competitors and regulators alike. What had begun as a humiliating incident of discrimination had evolved into something far more significant, a template for change that would ultimately reshape an entire industry's approach to equality and human dignity. 6 months after the incident on Flight 387, Amara stood before a packed auditorium at the National Transportation Equity Conference. Aviation executives, FAA officials, civil rights advocates, and industry experts had gathered to hear her keynote address on the implementation of the Jenkins-Turner Protocol. When we began this journey, she told them, many said meaningful reform was impossible. The industry was too entrenched, the problems too complex, the financial pressures too great. Today, I'm pleased to report that those predictions were wrong. She gestured to the screen behind her where data from Global Wings' first quarterly equity audit was displayed. In just 6 months, passenger removal incidents have decreased by 62% overall. More significantly, the racial disparity in those removals has been virtually eliminated. These aren't just statistics, they represent real people who were treated with the dignity they deserve. The transformation at Global Wings had been comprehensive. Every employee, from the CEO to the newest hire, had completed intensive bias training developed by experts in the field. New verification protocols required multiple sources of confirmation before passengers could be removed for non-safety issues. Anonymous reporting channels had already identified and addressed dozens of potential discrimination incidents before they escalated. Most importantly, the company culture had begun to shift. Flight attendants reported feeling empowered to stand up to high-status passengers who made unreasonable or prejudiced demands. Gate agents were trained to recognize and interrupt patterns of discriminatory treatment. Executives were now evaluated partly on equity metrics, creating accountability at every level. What makes this particularly encouraging, Amara continued, is that Global Wings isn't alone. 3 other major carriers have now adopted versions of the protocol, with 2 more announcing implementation plans for next quarter. The Jenkins Turner Foundation had become a powerful advocate for change, using its resources not just for scholarships, but for research and policy development. Its first cohort of scholars included 20 promising students from underrepresented groups pursuing careers in aviation and medicine. One of those scholars, Jasmine Reynolds, a talented young woman from South Chicago, studying aeronautical engineering, joined Amara on stage. Before the foundation, Jasmine explained to the audience, "I had the dream, but not the means. Now I have both, along with mentors who understand the barriers I face and are committed to helping me overcome them." The FAA had taken the reforms even further, incorporating elements of the Jenkins-Turner Protocol into its new guidelines for commercial carriers. Airlines were now required to collect and report data on passenger removals broken down by race and gender, with significant disparities, triggering automatic review. Crew training requirements had been expanded to include substantial content on recognizing and addressing bias. As for the individuals directly involved in the incident, their journeys continued to illustrate the power of accountability. Jennifer Blake and Heather Wilson, unable to find work in aviation, had taken very different paths. Jennifer retreated from public life, entirely refusing further comment on the incident. Heather, after a period of reflection, began speaking to flight attendant trainees about her experience, offering herself as a cautionary tale about the dangers of enabling discrimination. The Thompsons had divorced with Richard, citing the stress of the public scandal in divorce filings. Elaine, still socially ostracized despite numerous attempts at reputation rehabilitation, eventually moved to another state to escape the notoriety. Her name remained synonymous with entitled prejudice, a Google search for first-class Karen still bringing up her image years later. Carlos Mendez had been promoted to training supervisor at Global Wings, his personal experience of moral failure and redemption making him uniquely qualified to guide others through difficult ethical terrain. The most important lesson he often told new hires is that doing nothing is still doing something. When you witness discrimination and remain silent, you become part of the problem. Lawrence Davidson, who had initially viewed the incident as a crisis to be managed, came to see it as the most significant opportunity of his career. Under his leadership, Global Wings transformed from a company scrambling to contain a public relations disaster to an industry leader in equity and inclusion. The reforms not only improved the passenger experience, but strengthened employee morale and reduced turnover. Sometimes, he reflected in an industry publication, it takes a profound failure to create space for meaningful change. For Amara and Nathaniel, the journey had been exhausting, but deeply rewarding. They had channeled their justified anger into constructive action, creating change far beyond what they had initially imagined possible. As Amara concluded her keynote speech, she shared a personal reflection. 6 months ago, I was removed from a first-class cabin because I didn't match someone's image of who belonged there. Today I stand before you not as a victim of discrimination, but as an architect of change. She paused, looking out at the attentive faces. The true measure of our success won't be found in corporate policies or regulatory frameworks, though those are essential. It will be found in the experiences of ordinary travelers who never have to know what it feels like to be humiliated because of how they look. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Amara, but for the possibility she represented that systems which enable discrimination can be dismantled and rebuilt with justice and dignity at their center. That a single incident properly leveraged can catalyze transformation far beyond its original scope. That meaningful change, while difficult, is always possible when enough committed people refuse to accept the status quo. 1 year to the day after the incident on Flight 387, Amara and Nathaniel found themselves at JFK Terminal 4 once again. This time they were traveling together openly, boarding a Global Wings flight to Paris for a long overdue vacation. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked, giving her hand a gentle squeeze as they approached the first-class check-in counter. Amara nodded, surprised to find herself slightly tense despite everything that had changed in the past year. Old memories die hard, I guess. The check-in agent, a young woman named Tanya, recognized them immediately. Her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Dr. Jenkins Turner." "First Officer Turner. It's an honor to have you flying with us today." She processed their boarding passes with efficient professionalism, explaining the lounge access and boarding procedures as she would for any first-class passengers. No special treatment, no awkwardness, just the dignified service every traveler deserved. "Thank you, Tanya," Amara said, noting the woman's Jenkins Turner protocol pin discreetly affixed to her uniform, a small symbol adopted by airline employees who had completed the advanced training program. As they made their way through security and toward the first-class lounge, Amara was struck by how much had changed. Signs throughout the terminal advertised Global Wings' new commitment to equitable treatment. Digital displays featured diverse passengers enjoying premium services. Even the lounge itself had been redesigned to feel more welcoming and inclusive. Inside, a few travelers recognized them offering quiet nods of acknowledgement or respectful smiles. One elderly woman approached them hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. My granddaughter is one of your foundation scholars. She's studying to become a pilot." Amara smiled. "What's her name? Gabriela Ramirez." "Of course she's brilliant. I met her at the orientation last month." The woman's eyes shimmered with tears. Before your foundation, she didn't think someone like her could ever fly those big planes. Now she knows differently. Such encounters had become common over the past year. People approached not for selfies or sensationalism, but to share how the reforms had touched their lives, whether as travelers who felt more respected, employees who felt more empowered, or students who saw new possibilities for their futures. When it came time to board, Amara and Nathaniel joined the first-class line. A different Amara might have felt anxiety bracing for another confrontation, but today she felt only a calm certainty that things had changed. The flight attendant at the door greeted them with professional courtesy. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Jenkins Turner, First Officer Turner. Your seats are 2C and 2D. As they settled into their seats, Amara noticed subtle differences in how the cabin crew operated. They verified passengers' seating assignments discreetly but thoroughly regardless of appearance or attire. They addressed everyone with the same level of respect. When a misunderstanding arose between passengers over overhead bin space, a flight attendant resolved it with fair consideration for both sides, rather than automatically deferring to the more affluent-looking traveler. These were the Jenkins-Turner Protocol principles in action. Small, consistent practices that collectively created an atmosphere of equity and dignity. Midway through the flight, the lead flight attendant approached their seats. "Dr. Jenkins Turner," she said quietly, "I hope it's not inappropriate, but I wanted to thank you personally. I was working at Global Wings when everything happened last year. The changes you've helped implement have transformed how we do our jobs. We can finally focus on true service rather than status management." Amara smiled. That means a great deal to hear. Thank you. As the woman moved away, Nathaniel took Amara's hand. How does it feel? Coming full circle. Healing, Amara admitted. I didn't realize how much I needed to see the changes with my own eyes. The past year had been intense for both of them. Beyond their professional responsibilities, Amara's surgeries and Nathaniel's flights, they had devoted countless hours to developing and implementing the protocol, establishing the foundation, working with regulators, and advocating for industry-wide reforms. The work had been exhausting, but deeply fulfilling. There had been personal costs as well. Amara had received death threats from extremists who viewed her as a symbol of cancel culture. Nathaniel had faced backlash from colleagues who resented the increased scrutiny of the industry. Both had endured the intense public attention that came with unwanted celebrity. Through it all, they had maintained their focus on the work itself rather than the publicity surrounding it. They had declined book deals, movie rights, and speaking tours that would have made them wealthy but distracted from their mission. Instead, they channeled their energy into creating lasting change. Now, finally allowing themselves a moment of reflection, they could acknowledge the journey's toll and its rewards. I keep thinking about Elaine Thompson, Amara admitted quietly. Not with anger anymore, but with a kind of sadness. Imagine living with so much entitlement and prejudice that you deliberately hurt a stranger to preserve your sense of exclusivity. Nathaniel nodded. I heard she's living in Arizona now, completely removed from her former social circles. I don't wish her ill, Amara said thoughtfully. I just hope she's learned something from all this. And Jennifer Blake. Amara shook her head. That's different. She had a position of authority and responsibility. She enabled discrimination when she should have prevented it. They sat in contemplative silence as the aircraft continued eastward. Eventually, Nathaniel spoke again. Do you ever regret becoming the face of this issue, taking on all that public scrutiny? Amara considered the question carefully. No, she finally replied. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that in 2025 we still need to fight these battles, but I don't regret using our experience to create change. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing, Amara looked out the window at the approaching lights of Paris. She thought about all the passengers who would never know what it felt like to be removed from a flight because of how they looked. About all the crew members who now had clear protocols to follow when faced with discriminatory demands. About all the students who would enter aviation and medicine with the support of the foundation. We turned something ugly into something meaningful, she said softly. That's a form of healing, too. The aircraft touched down smoothly on French soil. As they taxied to the gate, Nathaniel leaned over and kissed her cheek. Ready for 2 weeks of just being us. No protocols, no foundation, no interviews. Amara smiled, feeling the tension of the past year finally beginning to release. More than ready. We've earned this. The impact of the Jenkins-Turner Protocol extended far beyond Global Wings, rippling through the aviation industry and beyond in ways few could have predicted. By the protocol's first anniversary, 5 major airlines had implemented its core principles, with 3 more in various stages of adoption. The comprehensive framework addressing everything from complaint verification to bias training to accountability structures had proven adaptable across different corporate cultures and operational models. What began as a crisis response transformed into a competitive advantage. Consumer surveys showed that travelers, particularly those from minority groups, were increasingly choosing airlines known for equitable treatment. Global Wings' once hemorrhaging customers in the aftermath of the incident had not only recovered but gained market share. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how the industry views diversity and inclusion, explained aviation analyst Sophia Morgan in a widely cited industry report. What was once treated as a compliance issue or PR concern is increasingly recognized as a core business imperative. The FAA had incorporated key elements of the protocol into its regulatory framework, requiring all commercial carriers to collect and report data on passenger removals broken down by demographic factors. Airlines with significant disparities faced increased scrutiny and potential penalties. "The data doesn't lie," FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds stated at a congressional hearing. "When we started requiring these metrics, some carriers showed removal rates for passengers of color at 5 to 7 times those of white passengers. Those numbers have dramatically improved as accountability has increased." The Jenkins-Turner Foundation had expanded its mission beyond scholarships, becoming a research and advocacy powerhouse focused on equity issues in transportation and healthcare. Its annual report documented both progress and persistent challenges, maintaining pressure on industries resistant to change. The Foundation's first class of scholars was already making waves. Jasmine Reynolds, the aeronautical engineering student from South Chicago, had developed an algorithm to detect potential bias in automated upgrade and boarding systems. Daniel Ortiz, a medical student at Johns Hopkins, was researching disparities in pain management for patients of color. Alexandra Washington, studying aviation management at Embry-Riddle, had created a conflict resolution framework specifically designed for gate agents facing high-stress passenger situations. The auditorium at the National Aviation Academy was filled to capacity. Industry leaders, government officials, civil rights advocates, and media representatives had gathered for the unveiling of a groundbreaking initiative, a collaborative effort between airlines, regulatory agencies, and advocacy organizations to establish industry-wide standards for equitable treatment. Amara stood at the podium surveying the assembled crowd. 2 years had passed since the incident on Flight 387, yet the journey that began in that first-class cabin continued to evolve in ways she could never have anticipated. Behind her on stage sat an impressive array of partners in the initiative. Lawrence Davidson, now retired, but still influential. FAA Administrator Michael Reynolds, representatives from major airlines and consumer advocacy groups, and the first graduating class of Jenkins-Turner Foundation scholars, 20 young people from diverse backgrounds who would soon enter aviation and medicine with a commitment to equity at the core of their professional identities. 2 years ago, Amara began her voice, steady and clear. "I boarded a flight as a passenger and was removed for how I looked rather than how I behaved. It was a personal humiliation that exposed a structural problem, one that affected countless travelers who lacked the resources or platform to challenge it." She paused, making eye contact with faces throughout the audience. "Today we're not here to revisit that incident, but to celebrate what has grown from it." The Jenkins-Turner Protocol began as a response to discrimination at one airline. It has evolved into a framework for transformation across an entire industry. On the large screen behind her, data visualizations illustrated the protocol's impact. Dramatic reductions in discriminatory incidents, improved passenger satisfaction across demographic groups, increased diversity in premium cabin bookings, and enhanced employee retention in customer-facing positions. These numbers matter. Amara continued, but they don't tell the whole story. The real impact is in experiences that don't happen. The travelers who aren't questioned, challenged, or removed simply because they don't match someone's image of who belongs in premium spaces. It's in the dignity preserved rather than the indignities endured. From her seat in the front row, Jasmine Reynolds, now completing her master's degree in aeronautical engineering, nodded in agreement. Beside her sat Daniel Ortiz, Alexandra Washington, and the other Foundation scholars, each bringing their unique perspectives to the work of reform. "Today we're announcing the next phase of this journey," Amara explained. "The Equitable Skies Initiative will expand the principles of the Jenkins-Turner Protocol beyond individual airlines to create industry-wide standards, backed by regulatory frameworks and independent monitoring." Lawrence Davidson stepped to the microphone. As founding partners in this initiative, Global Wings and 4 other major carriers are committing $50 million over 5 years to implementation training and ongoing assessment. We recognize that equity isn't just a moral imperative, but a business necessity in a diverse global marketplace. FAA Administrator Reynolds followed detailing the regulatory components that would give the initiative teeth. These standards will be incorporated into our certification and compliance frameworks, ensuring that equitable treatment becomes as fundamental to airline operations as safety protocols. Throughout the presentations, Amara watched the audience reactions. Some executives appeared skeptical, others enthusiastic. Civil rights advocates listened intently, measuring commitments against their own experiences and expertise. Journalists scribbled notes or recorded key points for their coverage. When the formal program concluded, Amara found herself surrounded by well-wishers, collaborators, and media representatives. She answered questions thoughtfully but kept glancing toward the back of the room where Nathaniel waited patiently. When she finally made her way to him, he embraced her warmly. "Proud of you, Dr. Jenkins Turner," he murmured in her ear. "Proud of us," she corrected him. "None of this happens without you." They made their way through the crowd toward the exit, accepting congratulations and fielding brief questions. Just before reaching the door, they were stopped by a woman they didn't recognize, middle-aged, professionally dressed with a hesitant expression. Dr. Jenkins Turner. "Officer Turner," she began nervously. "My name is Karen Daniels. I was a flight attendant for 23 years before retiring last year." Amara nodded encouragingly, waiting for her to continue. "I wanted to tell you..." Karen's voice trembled slightly. "I was part of the problem for a long time. I prioritized our highest status passengers above all others. I enabled behaviors I shouldn't have. I looked the other way when I saw colleagues treating people differently based on appearances." She took a deep breath. "Watching what happened after Flight 387, seeing the protocol developed and implemented it, made me re-examine everything about how I'd done my job. I've spent the past year volunteering with a program that helps young people from underserved communities prepare for aviation careers." "That's wonderful," Amara said sincerely. Karen nodded. "It's not enough to make up for 23 years of complicity, but it's a start." She extended her hand. "Thank you for forcing our industry to look in the mirror. It was long overdue." As they shook hands, Amara felt the full circle of their journey. The work wasn't about punishment or shame. It was about transformation and growth, both individual and institutional. Outside the auditorium, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the academy grounds. Students in various aviation programs hurried between buildings, their diverse faces reflecting the changing demographics of the industry. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked as they walked toward their car. Amara considered the question. "I'm thinking about all the black women who will board flights tomorrow and just be passengers, not symbols or test cases or cautionary tales, just travelers treated with the same dignity as everyone else." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the profound simplicity of that aspiration. "The sky belongs to everyone," Amara said, softly echoing the closing line from her speech. "And now finally, so do the pathways to reach it." As they drove away, leaving the academy behind, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the humiliation of Flight 387 to the triumph of industry-wide reform. From individual injustice to structural change. From pain to purpose. The work wasn't finished. Change never was. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in policies and protocols, but in possibilities. A door had been opened that couldn't easily be closed again. A standard had been set that couldn't readily be lowered. And somewhere on a flight taking off at that very moment, a passenger who looked like her was settling into a first-class seat without question or challenge, experiencing the simple dignity that should always have been their right. That in the end was the legacy that mattered most. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share this video with others who need to hear it. Your support helps spread awareness about discrimination that still happens every day in spaces where people of color are deemed not to belong. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of justice and transformation that will inspire you and remind you that change is possible when we stand up for what's right. Turn on notifications so you never miss our new uploads. Remember, change begins when we refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination in a premium space? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters and could help others feel less alone in their experiences. Together we can create a world where dignity is universal, not a privilege. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.